right, I'm ready.
Alrighty then. So, Dr. Dirk, I would want to ask you, first of all, thank you for having this interview with us.
Oh, sure.
Could you give us your official title and maybe other hats that you wear as a professional here on campus?
Well, I'm department head in philosophy and religion. I also was co-founder of the Institute for Citizenship and Social Responsibility, and I serve on that steering committee still. And I am executive director of a national organization called the Society for Values in Higher Education.
Perfect, thank you. So, why or how did you end up going into this particular field, specifically in religion and philosophy?
I really had no other abilities of any. No. I was a journalism major as an undergraduate, and then I took a general education course in comparative religion. I didn't have necessarily any sort of much of a religious background myself, religious upbringing, and but I took a class in comparative religion. I was just fascinated by it, especially Eastern religions. And I took another class, and then the summer before my senior year, I switched majors to religious studies. I had a mentor who asked me about graduate school and said, you know, you'd be a good person for that. Would you be interested? And it's a longer story about how certain things just kind of, I'm a very lucky person. About how certain things happened that sort of got me started on it. But then I went to MA program at Miami of Ohio for a year, and then that prepared me to do PhD work at Chicago, University of Chicago.
Oh, wow.
So it started just with this interest in these cool ideas. I did grow up in the South. I grew up in Nashville, so even though I didn't have a very strong religious upbringing personally, I think it's hard not to think about religion if you grow up in the South, even if you don't think of yourself as religious, because religion is such a prevalent force, an important institution in the South. And so it kind of opened up opportunities to think about some issues that I thought were really important. And then so it was really just kind of an intellectual passion that drove me to do what I do.
Perfect. You know, that was one of the things that I wanted to know, if you grew up religiously, and do you have to be religious to talk about religion?
Yeah, no, and in fact there's a funny, I don't know if people say this on the University of Chicago campus anymore, if somebody gets a PhD in religious studies at the University of Chicago, you get it through the Divinity School, which also offers a Master's of Divinity. But then the PhDs, I mean, this is the academic study of religion. It's just sort of a historical leftover that it all takes place in this Divinity School, right? Not that there aren't really religious people there, but anyway. But the joke on campus was always that if you wanted to go hang out with the atheists on campus, you'd go to the coffee shop at the Divinity School. And it was kind of a joke because wasn't really true. But the point of it was that at the Divinity School, that's where they do this sort of rigorous academic intellectual investigation of religion. Right, so there's certainly no necessary connection between the study of religion and one's own religious commitments. And when I say necessary, I mean there's certainly people who have religious commitments who go into religious studies, right? And there may very likely be people who go into religious studies and then develop certain religious commitments as a consequence of that. But there's no necessary connection to it. Religion is an institution, a cultural phenomenon that anybody can study whether or not you practice it or not.
Okay, which leads me into the next question. Do you think religion plays a part in all types of higher education institutions? Why or why not?
Well, I mean, I think it does to the extent that I mean, it's hard to imagine a religious institution that doesn't have students or faculty or staff who are religious in some way. And I think that particularly for deeply religious people, their religion informs a lot of what they do, right? It informs maybe their commitment to their jobs, their commitment to helping young people. It may inspire students to take up certain courses of study because they believe it fits in with a religious vocation that they might want to do in the future. So, I mean, there's a really good resource on some of these issues would be the Interfaith Youth Corps. Do you know about the Interfaith Youth Corps? It's IFYC. Its headquarters are in Chicago, and the Interfaith Youth Corps was started by a man named Eboo Patel. I don't know if you ever heard of Eboo Patel. I got a book by him somewhere up there. And he tells he's maybe in his 40s or something, very passionate, charismatic about the work that he does. And the Interfaith Youth Corps, their mission is the creating interfaith activities and conversations on college campuses. That's what they do.
Worldwide or just
you know, they may be international, but it's mostly the United States. And his background, he's Muslim, and he talks about, I've heard him speak several times, he's a very good speaker. And in fact, I even had a class here where I taught a class with Terry Shoemaker on interfaith work, and Eboo Patel was, we Skyped him in so the students could talk to him. And anyway, so very nice guy. And but he tells the story about being at the University of Illinois and it striking him as odd, and I think this was probably the 90s or something, you know, because I think he's about 10 years younger than I am. But he tells this story about being on the campus, and this was a time where, you know, there was lots of discussions about race and feminism and, you know, all the and sexuality, all these really big social issues, and it was just the campus was teeming with these conversations, right? And I forgot what the trigger was, but he said at some point it struck him as so amazingly odd that, especially given the way in which religion crisscrosses with these issues, that nobody was talking about religion on his campus, let alone. And if they were talking about religion on campus, it was, you know, the Baptists were having their conversation and the Methodists were having their conversation. Nobody was talking to one another, let alone having Christians talk to Muslims, right? And this really got him started on this path, you know. And so I tell the story, one, because the resource is great. You really should check out their website. There might be material for you that's beneficial. But the fact that what it gets at is this idea that religion is important to a lot of people. It defines who they are. It sort of frames their worldview. It affects the way they interact with one another. It can be a critical piece in sort of major life decisions that they make. And deeply religious people are on every college campus. And it seems odd, and this is where I would agree with Patel, it seems odd that there aren't places to have conversations across religious traditions at a place like a college or university. It just seems kind of crazy, because if there's any place in our country where we should be able to have these kind of conversations, it ought to be a college or university. On our campus, I mean, Terry and I taught this course one time. We had, I don't know why I keep pointing at you. Do you know Terry?
I interviewed with Terry.
Okay, yeah. Good. I thought you did. and then we also we created this activity. It was called We the People.
Okay.
Did you ever hear about this?
Is it the bowling?
Yeah.
I didn't get to hear much about it. But
So We the People it was kind of based on this. Do you know Robert Putnam's work, Bowling Alone? Robert Putnam is a sociologist. He wrote this book called Bowling Alone. And the idea of bowling alone is that we now live in a society where we no longer have community organizations. We're no longer interacting with one another in the ways we used to interact with one another, which helps to create social capital, which helps solve local problems, which engages people as citizens, blah, blah, blah. So, which is all true. I mean, it's an amazing book. So part of the inspiration for this, and this was almost all Terry's doing. I mean, he deserves a lot of credit for it. So was inspired by Putnam's book, and then our interest in sort of facilitating this conversations across religious groups, and so We the People was WII the people, as in We Bowling. So we had a We Bowling League. And student groups could sign up, and one of the years we did political groups. So we had like libertarians and Republicans and Democrats, and then they had to solve problems. And so you would bowl, but while you were bowling, you had various prompts that you had to respond to with one another to have a conversation. But one year we did it, we had religious groups. So we had we had the Baptists, we had a Muslim group, we had an atheist group, and it was all in this effort to generate a space where people could have these conversations. And Terry had a real passion for that, and so when he graduated and left, some of that energy left with him. But we have a graduate student in our department, another person who you may be interested in talking to, Emily Potter. You know Emily?
Yeah.
Are you going to talk to Emily?
Hopefully.
Okay. Because she started this club, right? The Interfaith
Campus Coalition.
And I should know it because I'm the faculty advisor. And I can't remember the name of it. Anyway. And, so she's, and I love this idea because, I mean, she's picked up on that passion that Terry had for it, that I have too, but is something that, it's better when it's a student-led sort of thing. And so, I mean, I think these are just sort of the kind of conversations that we all have on college campuses and that we have way too few of. Because, as one of you said, I mean, people really can be very afraid about talking about religion. Religion and politics, people have a lot of anxiety and fear about talking about them.
Which, again, what do you think is like the root or, the thing the biggest concern that people have with religion on campus or in general, both from a religious and non-religious view? Could you go more into the...
Well, and some of this is going to be kind of my guess at some of that. Because, I mean, in full disclosure, I mean, I'm a huge University of Tennessee football fan, so that's kind of my religion. And I have been connected with religious institutions in various ways in my life and continue to be. I don't necessarily consider myself a deeply religious person in the sort of stereotypical sense. So when I'm talking about what I think maybe are some of the obstacles for, say, religious students, I'm speaking a little bit not out of my own experience, and I'm surmising what I think may be part of that. And part of it is from talking to students too, and hearing them answer that kind of question, right? I think one of the things is a concern that we all have when we enter conversations about feeling like we don't know something well enough. We don't want to be embarrassed about talking about something that we fear we're not as knowledgeable about as we would like. I think that there may be a little of concern that, well, I'll put it in the context of students studying religion, right? I think in some cases students avoid our courses in part because they really don't want to be challenged about their religious beliefs. I don't think that's what we do necessarily. I mean, we don't directly do that. I mean, we don't send faculty into classrooms, right, to convince people that they're wrong, right? We send faculty into classrooms to engage in the academic study of this really fascinating cultural phenomenon. But even doing that sort of thing is an implicit challenge to one's religious worldview. It can be, right? Because people don't necessarily think of their religion as a really interesting cultural phenomenon. They think of it as God's revelation or truth with a capital T, or, which are all things that are much greater than an interesting cultural phenomenon, right? Even very interesting cultural phenomenon. So we certainly have had the experience of, student reticence about our classes, in part because of a sense that it doesn't honor or potentially it even denigrates religion in some way, that it gets reduced to one cultural phenomenon among many. So, and I know the question is about sort of people talking on campus, but I think that point about classes, which I feel more confident about talking about, may be part of the reason why people don't want to talk to each other about religion, right? Okay. Because part of really engaging with another person in a conversation about religion, and actually part of really engaging anybody in a conversation, a meaningful conversation, that is more than just, hey, I'm going to report what I think and you report what you think, right? I mean, that's a good thing. But that doesn't strike me as really a meaningful conversation, right? So part of engaging in a meaningful conversation is the willingness to acknowledge that the other person might have something to teach me, that I might learn from them, that I might revise some of my own beliefs or ideas as a consequence of that engagement. I mean, that's real dialogue, right? That's a hard thing to do if you have a particular view of your religious beliefs, right? If and this is a really difficult thing for some people, right? And so this is in a sense, I would argue from just my perspective, right? I would argue this is perhaps the greatest obstacle to interfaith dialogue, right? Which is that religions at their most extreme don't give people a set of sort of propositions that they can work with and revise and clarify and expand as a consequence of interactions with others. At their most extreme, they give you a set of propositions that you must accept as absolutely true. If you do that, it's hard to imagine why having a conversation with somebody is a useful thing, other than perhaps you converting them from their mistake, right? So interfaith conversation, in a certain sense, is almost the hardest possible conversation. It's almost easier to imagine, I was watching I went home for lunch and I was watching some of the Benghazi hearings, right, with Hillary Clinton. It's almost, more likely that the Republicans on that committee and Hillary Clinton could have a meaningful conversation than, in some cases, two religious people depending on how they view their religion and how they review certain propositions in their religion. So I think the obstacles are pretty high. Now, having said that, I think people like Ibu Patel and the Interfaith Youth Corps do amazing work. And what they try to do is to steer away from, just as an example, the Interfaith Youth Corps would not try to get two people together, a Muslim and a Christian, and have them somehow resolve whether or not Jesus was the Son of God, right? Nah, that ain't gonna happen, right? And it's a good thing for both of those individuals to be able to talk about how they might conceive of this person, this historical figure, Jesus. What the Interfaith Youth Corps does instead is try to encourage people to find those places where they do have common ground, and particularly through activities or doing things, right? So one thing that a Christian and a Muslim could agree upon is that we ought to care for the poor. So maybe they're on the college campus and engaged in the community, maybe there's an opportunity in which Christians and Muslims can get together to work on a project in the broader community that addresses issues of poverty. That's a no-brainer for either religion, right? They both have rich traditions in this regard, rules and exemplary models of that. So I think that's a good strategy, at least, to try to get over, again, what I think is a huge obstacle in interfaith dialogue about that question of certain propositional truths.
How do you incorporate religion in the curriculum? Like, how is religion curriculum incorporated or not incorporated in, say, different institutions such as the secular, non-secular, affiliated, or other types of institutions?
Yeah, I mean, I've always, I did work at before coming here, I was at a private institution that had a connection with the Methodist Church, and students were required to take one religion course. But it could be a religion course in anything. They could take a Buddhism course, and our department was like this department here. I mean, we were engaged in the academic study of religion. There's a long history, so I really won't go down this road. But and actually, it's a history that involves the Society for Values in Higher Education. But there's a long history of through the 20th century. Of schools, particularly public institutions, creating departments of religious studies, or religious studies is often kind of paired with philosophy, so like here. So relatively speaking, it's kind of a newer thing. I mean, theology has been taught in universities around the world for a very long time, but that was generally at institutions that had a religious connection where, students have to go take a theology class or two classes, or depending on the institution. Sometimes schools require, 3 or 4 courses in religious studies / theology for their students. Certainly a public institution doesn't do that. So I don't know any public institutions that require a course in religion. It just constitutionally probably doesn't quite work well. But throughout the 20th century, there was this sort of explosion of religious studies programs across the country at public institutions. And there's several reasons for that, and in fact, the Supreme Court even had to, rule on some issues related to this. And these departments, though, are the academic study of this very interesting cultural phenomenon, right? And so I don't think that there's any issue there. And what we do in our department is to the field of religious studies is often sort of broken up into the kind of religious studies on the one side and biblical studies on the other. We do both in our department, but biblical studies is just like everything else we do. I mean, it's the academic study of this incredibly important text in the history of not only the Western world, but just the world. And so, it makes complete sense to me that just like any efforts to study the human condition, religion is a central part of it, and universities and colleges ought to spend time thinking about it.
Very good.
I have a question.
Yes.
So we've kind of talked about this a little bit, but I guess I'm coming from the standpoint of seeing a lot of news stories and things coming out of secondary education and primary education about expressions of faith in school. Do you think that the university setting should be a place that is more inclusive of these expressions of faith, like prayer or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, higher education doesn't, because most institutions are spread out over many buildings, and there's not sort of a uniform time. You go to the building at 8 and come out at 3:30. You don't end up quite with the same sort of issues. So somebody who's Muslim, for example, who is committed to prayer at noon. If they're in a public school setting, then I would agree that those schools need to accommodate that that religious commitment, and I don't think it's that hard to do that sort of thing. So on a college campus, you don't face exactly that kind of issue because students can schedule their classes when they want and stuff like that. And I think the university makes a lot of efforts to accommodate students, and I think that faculty are more aware now than certainly they were even 10 years ago of Muslim holidays or Jewish holidays, or things that come up on the calendar that look, that student has that religious commitment, and we know that it's going to fall on the day that you have class, and I think faculty are generally happy to accommodate that sort of thing. I mean, at least, and I could be missing something, but I don't think we have a lot. I don't think we have an issue so much of, people of particular religious faiths not being, or being forced by the structures of the institution to make them incapable of practicing it. Okay. Having said that, I don't necessarily, I don't know that we have a campus climate that strongly encourages a more outward expression, and let alone that sort of engagement that I was talking about. There may be some of that, but I mean, I think the reason why Emily, I shouldn't mention her name. I mentioned all kinds of names. Oh, I blown everybody's cover. Okay.
It's all good.
The reason why I think Deborah created the Interfaith Campus Coalition.
Yes.
Is because, I mean, she's been involved sort of in religious life on campus, and she recognized that there weren't these sorts of conversations, and that people were sort of siloed in their particular religious faith.